Okay, students, it seems like we only have 3 students here this morning, but I'm going to go ahead and start the lecture. I hope you had a great weekend. There was a test up. I'm not quite sure when I made it due. If you need to do another attempt at it, please let me know. We're in midterms right now. Well, we're actually after midterm. Probably going to have about another month left of school. If you need me to reopen other assignments, please let me know. You have to email me in order to do that. If you miss the assignments due to a mitigating circumstance, then I will take that into account. Today we're going to talk about World War I. We talked about the causes of World War I, and then we're going to talk about American entry into World War I on Wednesday's lecture. So today I'm just going to give you a background on what it was like for the European powers who had been at war for they'd been at war for 3 years, and how they went into the stalemate. So, no, Miss Nadia, there wasn't a test number 5, not yet. There will be within the next 2 weeks, though. All the other tests, some people didn't even take them. Others were not able to sign on. Those are mitigating circumstances, so I'll make allowances for that so you can. Last Wednesday, I lost internet connectivity. That seems to be a big thing lately, so I wasn't able to do that. Can everybody hear me okay? Just let me know if you can hear me. I'm going to continue. I can see your answers in the chat box. Okay. Now, we talked about the inevitability of war with June 28, 1914. Archduke Francis Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated. On July 5th, Germany issues Austria-Hungary a blank check. Now, that means they're going to let Austria-Hungary do whatever it takes, okay? They pledged the military assistance if AH goes to war against Russia, and, of course, there were those military alliances that occurred. Okay, on July 23rd, Austria issues an ultimatum to Serbia. And, of course, no matter what Serbia did, it didn't matter. On July 28th, 1914, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. July 29th, 1914, Russia orders full mobilization of troops, which means that they're going to protect their little brother, which was Serbia. August 1st, 1914, Germany declares war on Russia. And August 2nd, 1914, Germany demands Belgium declare access to German troops. Now, Belgium neutrality, that means that they're not on either side. You see? So Germany was asking for this for a specific purpose, and I will explain that later on in the lecture. The King of Belgium was Albert I. He denied them permission to come into Belgium. August 2nd, 1914, Germany declared war on France. Why? Because they were part of the surroundment, the encirclement of Germany. And, of course, Germany and France were always at each other's throats. Now, what does this have to do with American history, you ask? Well, anytime you have a war, there's a problem. It's going to disrupt the economy. It's going to disrupt trade. It's going to disrupt all kinds of things like that. So when you look at a war, what does this have to, well, that's what it has to do with it, because it is going to disrupt diplomatic relations, economics, trade, things of that nature. So when we look at on August 4th, 1914, Great Britain declared war on Germany for violating Belgian neutrality. Great Britain had a treaty with Belgium that went back to 1839. And if ever another power had violated neutrality, now what does that mean? That means that the German army is going to march across Belgium. And that's violating neutrality, because Belgium is not on either side of this. But Belgium was forced to fight because of the German invasion. This was the status of European powers on August 9th, the start of the war. Germany and Austria-Hungary were the central powers. Neutrals are all the other ones in here. France was an allied power, Great Britain and Russia, and they were all part of that alliance system. Remember the MAIN, M-A-I-N, militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. In 1914 and 1915, there were illusions about this war. Many Europeans were excited about the war. They wanted to defend themselves against the aggressors. And domestic differences were put aside so that the country could come together and fight against a common enemy. Now, the war, a lot of them believed that the war would be over in a matter of a few weeks, and they ignore the length of the brutality of the American Civil War. It was the prototype to World War I, specifically trench warfare, which we're going to get into talking about in here. And before we get into the American entry, which we're going to talk about in the next lecture, they knew what they were in for. And trench warfare was just very stagnant. It didn't move. And I'll show you some things that occurred during trench warfare. It was brutal, ladies and gentlemen. It was a 20th century war used with 19th century tactics. The belief that modern industrial warfare could not be conducted for more than a few months. They wanted them to be home by Christmas, but there was a new weapon. It was the machine gun, and it fired 600 rounds a minute, had a range of about 2,000 yards. The only problem is it couldn't traverse, which means you couldn't move it from left to right or up and down. You had to situate machine guns, any number of them, in different spots so that they had crossfire up against the trenches, and they were deadly, absolutely deadly. A lot of times the men who were killed did not see the person that killed them, or you didn't see the person that you killed. And this is a photo of a Maxim machine gun. It's pretty big, very heavy. If you notice, there's a little hose right here going in. It was water cooled, and what happens is you have a hose going in this way, and then you have another hose coming out, and that hose would go into a water can where the condensed water would actually sit, and then it would just keep recycling, and it would cool the barrel. Because if you didn't cool the barrel would melt. Okay, so that was one of the things that they needed for, that they used for World War I. In fact, a lot of the European powers, with the exception of Germany, never purchased this weapon. It was invented by an American by the name of Hiram Maxim. It could fire 600 rounds a minute, all right, which was a lot back then. The fatal attraction of war was it was an exhilarating release from everyday life. A lot of people considered it a glorious adventure. War would rid the nations of selfishness and spark a national rebirth based on heroism. Now, these are American troops right here, okay? And a lot of them pursued and perpetuated the noble principles for which they fought and died. And then after a while, when you're sitting on the front, you're going, God, I don't want any more of war. You know, a lot of people saw it as a way to gain glory and gain fame and prestige. Well, it doesn't. It just gains death and destruction, is basically what it does. You have very few heroes, and basically heroes do things, they're scared, but they do things anyway. There's a difference between a hero and a coward. A coward is scared, doesn't do anything. Hero's scared, but he does something anyway. And if anybody says they're not scared in combat, they're lying to you. I've interviewed a lot of combat veterans stemming from World War II all the way up to the Afghanistan War. This was one of the reasons why the Germans wanted to go through Belgium. And this is what was known as the Schlieffen Plan. Now, the Schlieffen Plan was developed by a German general by the name of Alfred Schlieffen was his name. And he developed this plan, and what he wanted was to go through Belgium, use Belgium as a stepping stone to get to France. And it was basically 7/8 of the German army. The other eighth was right here, blocking their flank. And what they wanted to do was the German army wanted to go wholesale invade, if you follow it, and go around Paris, and the war would be over in 6 weeks. Well, what happened was, and I'm going to show you what happened during the war, is that they turned too soon before they made this arc, but they needed Belgium because that's where they were going to march through to get to France. The Schlieffen Plan was the Western Front was going to be first. Now, this is a world war. It was all over the world, but a lot of concentration was done in the Western Front in Europe. After defeating France, they would concentrate on the Eastern Front, but they wanted to avoid a two-front war. Well, in avoiding that two-front war, guess what? They had more than two fronts. There was 3 or 4 fronts during this war. So this is what the Schlieffen Plan did. Let me see if I can open this up a little bit, because it's... Kind of, yeah. Okay, here we go. Ta-da! Okay, so when we look at this plan, Germany made a vast encircling movement through Belgium to enter Paris. They underestimated the speed of British mobilization and quickly sent troops. The British quickly sent troops to France. So what happens is the Germans actually try to go around Paris. But what happens is this arc right here gets flattened, so they wind up in front of Paris. And the French army, who's waiting for this invasion, go, hey, you know what? They're flattening the arc, man. Let's attack them from the side. So they attacked them to the flank. And what happened was the Germans got pushed back and pushed back and pushed back until finally they dug trenches to stake their claim on the Western Front. September 6th to the 10th, 1914 was the Battle of the Marne. It stopped the Germans, but the French troops were exhausted. Both sides dug trenches for shelter, and you see this word right here, this word, stalemate, okay? And that means everything stops. You're not getting anywhere. And the Germans were going, okay, now we have to build trenches, all right? Well, the French had a plan too. It's called Plan 17, and what they were going to do was attack this way into Germany, but it didn't work out that way because they needed most of their troops to defend against the Germans marching in. Of course, the British had landed near Belgium, and they were in the northern part of France, and they had to make their way down to the south. So the British were there and saw a lot of combat at the beginning. At the beginning of the war, it was mobile, but it didn't move that much. After the Battle of the Marne, it was stalemate. They dug trenches. Now, trenches were dug from the English Channel to Switzerland, approximately 6,250 miles. They were 6 to 8 feet deep, and they immobilized both sides for 4 years. And if you look at this, you'll see that this is how it looks from above. You have the front trench, then you may have a communications, medical, and then a food trench, and then you have the back line. So if you look at this right here, basically let me see if I can enlarge this for you. Okay. Okay. You see, wait, we went to the next one. I didn't want to go to the next one. All right. If you look at this part right here, it'll show you, let me move this over. It'll show you basically what a trench looked like, and let's go a little further in. No. All right, and move this over. So this is what a trench actually looked like during the First World War. And they got these guys underground, literally, and I'm going to show you how the other trenches looked. They had dugouts underneath, and those dugouts, they kept you safe. Well, what we don't realize now, what we don't understand, a lot of people don't understand, is how they could have basically lived in these things for months, years at a time. It was rough going. It was really rough going living in these places, for months at a time. And this is what the Americans had to encounter. So this is like a cross section of a dugout, which is like, here's the trench, the front of the trench. It goes down about 30 feet underground, and they were very, very safe, most of them anyway, unless you had a shell that bored into the ground. Hello, Jules, how are you? That bored into the ground and blew up, destroying these dugouts. This is a British drawing of what a trench life was in the trench. And, of course, you ate there, you went to the bathroom there, you went weeks without a bath, there was lice, there were rats, there was just everything you can think of. But they lived there, and they had to live there. They had to man that line, or else the enemy was going to attack and overrun that line. Now, you have a system of trenches, and then you have an area here called no man's land. And that's very important. Now, what does that mean? Neither side owns that. It could be anywhere from 700 yards to about 1.5 miles, 2 miles. And nobody owned it. And if you stepped out into it, you got hit by a sniper or you got hit by machine guns. Life in the trenches, it was an elaborate system of defense. There was barbed wire, there were concrete, machine gun nests, mortar batteries, and troops lived in holes underground. It was a very miserable existence, but as a soldier on the Western Front, that's what had to happen. It had to be that way. Soldiers read to pass the time. They wrote letters. They had visits from celebrities from the day. Sarah Bernhardt was an actress. She came out to the front to read poetry to the soldiers, British soldiers. I'm sorry, German soldiers. And so they were very. That was their lives. That's how they lived. There were a lot of dangers involved. Snipers. There were trench raids. There was artillery. There was constant artillery bombardment on the Western Front, sometimes 24 hours a day. Death is everywhere in a trench. We had, quote, we all had on us the stench of dead bodies, end quote. Death numbed the soldiers' minds. There was shell shock, which now we refer to as PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder that a lot of troops have. They have flashbacks from the war. Now, the dead bodies, a lot of time they didn't have time to bury them. And if you died in a trench, they basically shoved your body up against the wall and buried you in the wall because your body shored up that defense. Well, guess what? Excuse me. In addition to all the other things, with the stench of the dead, there was the stench from human waste, stink, everything. And it was just death all around. Like, death is everywhere. Now, shell shock caused irreparable damage. People would get shakes. They would twinge. They would cringe in fear. It was just one of those devastating things that occurs during warfare. You take a citizen, you train them. You don't train them for everything. There are situations that they can be involved in that they've never experienced before. There was the threat of gas. Mustard gas was a yellow gas that the Germans perfected. It was carried by the wind, and it burned out soldiers' lungs, literally, and killed them. It was deadly in the trenches where it would sit at the bottom. The gas would come across no man's land, and it would it was very heavy, so it would seek lower ground, and it would go right into the trenches, and it would just linger there for days. And it would kill any number of troops. And mustard gas not only burned out soldiers' lungs, but it also burned the flesh as well. This is an American soldier that had blisters all over him from the mustard gas. They had gas masks by that time, but later on in 1922 at the Geneva Convention, they outlawed poisonous gas in war. Trench warfare baffled military leaders. They wanted to attempt a breakthrough whenever they could and then return to a war of movement. Millions of young men were sacrificed attempting the breakthrough. It's been said that, if you do the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result, that's the definition of insanity. Well, that's what trench warfare was, because what would happen is, like the British were going to attack the Germans. First, they would start with an artillery barrage, and then that would stop. Well, the Germans knew, they caught on. As soon as the artillery barrage would stop, the soldiers would rush across no man's land, and they would be open targets, you see. Now, there were several battles that took place. This one, the Battle of Verdun, was February 23rd, 1916. And it was a German offensive, and basically the Germans had no objective. They wanted just to kill as many French soldiers as they could. Now, the battle took 10 months. It wound up being in a stalemate, even though there were some gains initially in the beginning by the Germans. But there were 700,000 men killed on both sides. That is an unacceptable rate of casualties. That's a lot of men. After a while, the French lost so many men, they just lost count and stopped counting. This is where the French soldiers were brought when they were wounded. And it was 10 months long. I mean, it was huge. It was a huge battle. France still has marks from it today, and they take a lot of pride in it. There were new weapons that crippled the frozen front. We had mentioned poisonous gas. Actually, there were 4 different types of poisonous gas. The first was tear gas. That wasn't real effective. It just caused a lot of tearing and coughing and things of that nature. I could tell you I was exposed to it during basic training, and it's nothing to laugh at. All right, it's you cough for a couple of hours. But the Germans looked for other things, and they came up with what was known as phosgene gas. And phosgene gas would actually, it's a respiratory irritant, so it would cause you to cough up tissue from your lungs. All of them, except for tear gas, were very deadly. And then finally, the chlorine gas, which is also a respiratory irritant, and that was very dangerous, very dangerous. And then finally, the mustard gas, which would burn away skin. There were hand grenades. There were flamethrowers. These were things that made their appearance in World War I. Airplanes, fighter airplanes and bombers later on in the war. Tanks, which didn't prove to be that much of an effective weapon in the war. Not until World War II did we see it, the improvement. And submarines. Submarines were used against navies and against blockades, and they were very effective as well. In fact, there was a submarine that actually sank the Lusitania, which is one of the reasons why the United States got into World War I, and we're going to talk about it a little bit later. Airplanes, we always, I don't. If you watched Charlie Brown when you were a kid, you noticed that Snoopy used to fly a doghouse, and fight the Red Baron. The Red Baron actually did exist in World War I. There were dogfights in the air between airplane fighters. This was considered noble combat. Bombing was very inaccurate, and it romanticized battlefields. Paris and London were both bombed, but London was bombed by what they call Zeppelins, which are large hydrogen-filled balloons. And pilots fired pistols at each other and threw grenades at each other earlier in the war, before they got the machine guns that were placed upon the front of the plane. Now, earlier in the war, this was a problem because there was no... you'd have to fire the machine gun through the propeller, and the propellers were made of wood. So what the pilots used to do is put like sheaths of steel over the propellers, and when the bullets hit, they would ricochet all around the pilot. That wasn't any good. Well, there was an engineer he was Dutch. His name was Anthony Fokker, Fokker. He developed what was called the interrupter gear, which means that every time you pulled the trigger of the machine gun would not fire when the propeller blade was passing through it. So that made things a lot more deadlier, because now you could fire endless rounds through that machine gun. There was another front called the Eastern Front, where the Russian army moved into Eastern Germany. Now, because the Schlieffen Plan failed to knock France out of the war, Germany had to fight on two fronts. Actually, like I said, more fronts. There was Africa that they fought there too. Russian army moved into Eastern Germany on August 30th, 1914. They were defeated, even though they were larger. But the Russian army was not as well trained as the Germans. The Austrians were kicked out of Serbia. The Italians attacked Austria in 1915. They became an ally to France and Great Britain and Russia. And G came to Austrian aid and pushed Russians back 300 miles into their own territory. That stands for Germans. And this war just started to become a bloodbath, with the same thing happening over and over again. I have a friend of mine that just retired from Special Forces in the United States Army, who was stationed in Europe. And he has an interest in World War I as well. And he said, Alan, both of us being former soldiers, he said, well, he was in longer than I was. He was in like 30 years longer than I was. He said, a lot of these generals that sent these men to fight, they should have been prosecuted for murder, because basically that's what they were going to do. And there was a phrase that came out of World War I that was, these were lions led by donkeys. Because the soldiers, the average foot soldier was very brave. But there were a lot of generals that were killed during the war as well, but they just didn't, they kept coming up with these offensives, and everything was going to work theoretically, but practically it didn't work. There was much more. The Eastern Front was much more mobile than the West, but loss of life was still very high. In 1915, 2.5 million Russians were killed, captured, or wounded. Now, Russia is a huge country. In fact, if you put the United States inside of Russia, Russia has 24 time zones. We only have 4. So they're huge. But they had a lot of men, but they were ill-equipped, they were ill-trained, and that's one of the reasons why they got killed. Germany and Austria-Hungary joined Bulgaria in 1915 and attacked and eliminated Serbia from the war. Now, we're going to talk about American entry on Wednesday, but I want to point some things out to you that the war ends finally after the U.S. joins the war on the Allied side. There's an armistice on November 11th, 1918, basically a ceasefire. And then there was the Treaty of Paris. And we're going to talk about how instrumental Woodrow Wilson was in the Treaty of Paris when we talk about American entry. So we're gonna delve into that because the United States played a big part in the ending of the war, especially through Woodrow Wilson, and also in winning the war because we sent a lot of troops over there. The death toll finally on the Allied powers was 42 million had served, and there were 22 million casualties. So more casualties were killed on the Allied side, which means France, Russia, and Great Britain, than there were on the Central Powers. But you had a lot of things that occurred. When men came back from combat, they did not look the same. You know, a lot of times they had bad facial injuries. The French used to call them the coeur d'essai, I believe, which means men with broken faces. And there were noses missing. I mean, jaws missing. They had to have their whole eyes. They had to have their faces reconstructed. One of the things that came out of World War I was plastic surgery, rudimentary plastic surgery. Okay? So, what was the social impact? Again, men lost limbs and were mutilated. The birth rate fell markedly in France. If I had to put a price tag on France, they lost almost a whole generation of young men who could reproduce. Invalids were unable to work, so who's going to support them? If you can't work, you were wounded, you served your country, so you have to pay a pension. There was ethnic hostility still involved with the countries that were trying to fight for nationalism, and you had an influenza epidemic. Now, there's been reference to this over the last 7 months concerning the pandemic that we're allegedly in now. The influenza epidemic killed more people. It killed over 150 million people worldwide, with 500,000 of those being in the United States. And the reason why is because once it got to Europe, it started hitting the soldiers and started killing the soldiers. And this was a rabid flu. It's a respiratory disease, starts in the lungs, and it basically, these young men, these young strapping young men who were fighting for their countries were afflicted the worst than young children and old people. It seemed like the people that were in their prime of life, they were the ones that were getting they were dying. And of course people wore masks. If you pull up pictures on the internet about the influenza epidemic of 1918, this kind of hits home personally because my great-grandmother died of the flu in 1918 in Louisiana. My grandfather was only 13 years old when his mother died. And I remember there was a picture of a woman next to his bed. And a few months before he passed away, I said, "Papa, who is that?" He said, "That was my mom." And he explained to me the whole thing, which gave me an interest in learning about the influenza epidemic because of the simple fact that, back then it was necessary to wear a mask, but it was a virus. And the masks did not help it because viruses were so small and so many people got it. Well, when it went to the front in Europe, the disease, the virus mutated. So by the time it got back to the United States, what was working to fix it before or cure it before was not working. And back then, we could not view viruses because we had to have electron microscopes because they're so small. We could look at bacteria, but we couldn't look at viruses. The psychological impact was that the world was never going to have innocence again. The lights went out for 4 years and didn't come back on until 1918, and even after the Treaty of Versailles, which we're going to talk about in the one of our future lectures, because World War I, to me as an historian, was the most important conflict of the 20th century because a lot of things came out of it, and I'm going to explain it. Modern day terrorism came out of it. And so when you look at World War I, people go, oh, it's just another war, There were some black units that fought in World War I. In fact, there was a pilot by the name of Eugene Bullard. And Eugene Bullard had left the United States to go to France to box. And what he noticed was the French don't recognize skin color. And he was they were very nice to him. They gave him an opportunity. Well, when France entered World War I, he joined a fighting unit where he was a pilot. He was a fighter pilot. And actually, the Germans feared him. They called him the Black Swallow of Death. Well, when the United States entered the war, they wouldn't let him become a pilot because he was black. They put him in the infantry. Well, he fought in the infantry with I think there was the 90th, the 92nd, and the 93rd Infantry Divisions were predominantly black. And they had already distinguished themselves because General Pershing would not let them fight along with the American Army. So he let the French use them, and they distinguished themselves. They had to wear French uniforms because Pershing said, well, if they embarrass us, I don't want them wearing an American uniform. And they distinguished themselves. And a lot of Congressional Medal of Honor winners and Silver Star winners for bravery came out of those units. Well, when Eugene Bullard came back to the United States, he became one of the first postal pilots in the country and kind of disappeared from history for a while until the early 1960s. General Charles de Gaulle, who was a veteran of the Battle of Verdun, he was French, became president of France, and in the early 60s, he came to the United States, and he said, I would like you to take me to the Empire State Building, please. I would like to go meet somebody. And so they brought him there, and they thought it was kind of odd, but Eugene Bullard was working the elevator at the Empire State Building, so he wanted to meet him. He'd never met this man who had fought so valiantly for France. So it was a very telling war as far as tactics and strategy and people's feelings about war itself. A lot of the great commanders in World War II had come out of World War I. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, this is the end of the lecture. I know we're supposed to go 50 minutes, but I'm a little 12 minutes short. But I wanted to stop here because I didn't want to start another lecture that's probably going to go a little bit longer. So look for this lecture, the link on Moodle and the PowerPoint, and therefore you can use it to study. So I have everyone here, Nadia, let's see, Miss Walker, DeAndre, okay, and Jules. I have everybody down. So I will see you at another time, Wednesday, same time. I will send you the link, and then we'll start with the next lecture. So I'll see you then. Bye-bye.